All right, since Christmas, I've been talking about my first attempts at home brewing, but it may help you to actually hear from somebody who not only brews their own beer, but actually knows what they're talking about. We welcome the Beverly Brewmaster to Radio Exposed. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, as an intro to home beer brewing, tell us what are the advantages to brewing your own beer as opposed to just going out to the store and just buying it?
Well, I suppose technically, if you want to try to do it on the cheap, it could probably cost less. But really, I think for pretty much everybody I know that homebrews, it's an extension of just sort of that passion of you're into beer. You kind of want to take it to that next level, and it's just like people who are into making food, people who start their own bands, anything like that. It's an opportunity for you to sort of experiment yourself and really get an idea of different styles and different flavors and doing it yourself.
So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the actual home brewing process, most people, when they do this, when they jump into something like making their own food or starting a band or something, obviously starting your own band, if you start making your own music and you like what it sounds like, it's free. But as far as craft beers, you would judge them based off of what you would buy them at. So what are them? Most of them are 6-packs that you buy them at, and let's say rough estimate $8.99 on average.
Uh-huh.
Weigh that over buying a 24-pack of Miller Lite, like a case of Miller Lite for $13.99. Convince the person who gets those things at the supermarket on buying their own or making their own beer.
I would say, it's not necessarily a financial thing. It is cheaper to I think you make an initial investment of say $80 in a homebrew kit, and then you can probably make a batch of beer for around $40, which is going to be 5 gallons, which is going to be 48, roughly 48 bottles. So if you're comparing it to Miller Lite, you're better off buying your Miller Lite. But if you're comparing it to say a local craft beer, a Two Brothers beer, a Metropolitan beer, something like that, it's going to be cheaper. But I think people who get into homebrewing, they're not drinking their homebrew instead of buying it. It usually kind of one leads to the other and vice versa.
So when you're brewing your beer, do you have beer in tow, or have you brewed enough beer now where you've reached that point where you're just rolling out your own beer while making your own beer?
Well, the funny thing is actually, I still definitely buy plenty of craft beer, both just to drink because I like it and because it inspires you to try new styles. Maybe you want to brew a porter, so you go out and buy a few different porters to get an idea what you like. But as I brew more, I do find that I start getting stockpiles of bottles that I buy, and I have to actually make a point to be like, okay, this week I'm not gonna drink my own beer. I'm gonna try and go through some of this other stuff, which is pretty nice problem to have.
So, of all the beers that you've brewed, what seems to be your go-to style?
I'm a big German beer guy, which actually is probably a little bit unusual in the homebrewing community. But probably one of my favorite styles to brew is, I guess I'd probably say like a Munich Helles, which is basically in German beer, your light lagers, they're sort of a spectrum. And when I say light lagers, I mean light colored, not Miller Lite. But they're sort of like a spectrum between, your Pilsner, which is very hoppy, and then your Munich Helles, which isn't very hoppy at all. And then you can get like in between is a Dortmunder Export, which is kind of a little hoppy and a little malty. But really all along that spectrum, any kind of light German style lager, just nice and crisp. I love having one of those on tap at any time.
I go through my phases where once in a while I'll just be driving like at work. I'm like, when I get home, I want an English ale, or I might want a Czech lager. Like, how easy is it to if I just wanted a batch to have either of those two? Well, what would you say is the easier to do?
I mean, actually, lagers are tougher in a couple different ways, but mainly just because lagers are fermented at a colder temperature. And so unless it's the winter and you have a basement that's around 50 degrees, you can't brew a lager unless you have some sort of refrigeration that you can use. So, for somebody like me who knew that, I knew I wanted to brew German beer when I got into this. One of the first things I did was buy a chest freezer with an external thermostat. But most people aren't going to do that. And so, I think, giving those examples, I think, something, British style or something like that is going to be, easier than a lager. But really, I think a lot of the hoppy beers, I would actually argue, are probably some of the easiest to brew because they're a little more forgiving. Hops are a pretty strong flavor, and the minor sort of off flavors that you might get when you're starting off are going to get covered up by the hops.
All right, first step. Let's say the radio exposed listener out there is like, this sounds pretty neat. I want to get into beer brewing. What do I need if I were to really start getting into this?
What I would do is I would just, you can buy a starter kit through either at one of your local homebrew stores, or you can go on online homebrew stores or even eBay. But you can buy a beginner kit for about $75. That's basically going to be 2 buckets. You need 2 buckets. You need a stock pot, and then you just need some tubing, your bottle capper, obviously some empty bottles. But really, in terms of the main equipment you need, it's really 2 buckets and a stock pot.
Now, some of the other tubing you need, like let's see, you need the one tube that goes from the one bucket to the other, right?
Yeah.
And then you need something to measure the specific gravity.
Yeah. You should have it's called a hydrometer. And what that does is it's literally measuring the amount of sugar that's in the beer. And that's important because the sugar is what gets converted to alcohol. So if you want to know how much alcohol is in your beer, what you do is you measure your original gravity, which is the amount of sugar that was in it before you fermented, and then your final gravity, which will tell you the amount of sugar that's left. And then that difference tells you, what the difference is what was converted to alcohol. So once you know those 2 variables, then you can calculate how much alcohol is in your beer.
All right, so every listener just now got 2 buckets, a series of tubing, a hydrometer, and
excellent,
and some type of
stock pot.
What are we missing? Yeah, stock pot. Yeah. So now, what do we throw in there? I know there's a series of malts, wheats, hops. What's the first step? What's the first step in the fermentation?
Well, I guess first of all, I should clarify that there are 2 ways that you can brew. There's extract brewing, and then there's all grain brewing. And the difference is sort of like, I guess to sort of make an easy example, it would be sort of like the difference between making brownies with a store-bought mix or making brownies from scratch. Okay. So most people, when they start brewing, they're going to start by doing extract brewing. And that's what I did for 2.5, 3 years.
I believe that's what I'm doing with Mr. Beer, right?
What's that?
And with Mr. Beer, I'm doing extract brewing almost to the point where it's ludicrous, right?
Yeah, like most extract, like if you go to a homebrew store or you go online, a lot of places will sell you extract kits, and what they're going to have is they're going to have your base malt extract. They're going to have, a lot of times they'll have some sort of extra grains to steep, and then they'll give you hops. What Mr. Beer does is it actually even simplifies all that, and it gives you one syrup that is already everything combined, and it even has hop extract in it. So literally all you're doing is dumping syrup into a pot with some water and boiling it.
Mm-hmm.
What you're doing, if you go out and buy a homebrew kit and you buy your own, either you buy your own ingredient kit, or you can actually just make your own recipe and assemble it yourself. Then usually what you're going to do is you're going to buy some malt extract. Then you're going to also buy some extra grains if you need it. and then you're going to buy the hops. And so that's generally when you're extract brewing, that's what you're going to have.
All right. Now, as far as steeping, like I've seen the process of steeping. Like I've read books, I've read your blog, and I've seen it. I've seen people that have dealt with it. But when you see the commercials, like especially for Sam Adams, for example, you just see them dumping buckets of stuff into a giant thing.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if that's steeping. What's the difference between steeping and doing the work directly?
Well, I mean, the idea of steeping is, and I'm going to try not to get too technical here, but there are two types of typically there are two main types of grains that you use. There are base grains, and then there are specialty grains. And your base grains are what essentially you're getting in your extract. And those base malts, if you're doing all grain brewing, what you're doing is you're letting the entire, you're letting the grains sit at about 150 degrees, or steeped in water about 150 degrees for roughly an hour. And then you're basically rinsing the water out of it almost like you're making coffee. And the reason you're doing that is because the base malts have starches in there, which are complex carbohydrates, and you need to let the enzymes that are in the malt break those starches down into simple sugars that the yeast can actually ferment. Now, when you're doing extract brewing with grains, that extract is literally, it's like that whole mashing process I just described. Somebody else does that and then boils it down into a syrup and sells it to you. So you already have that base stuff. Now what you want to do is to sort of tweak it and kind of make it a little more what you want. You use specialty grains, and specialty grains are processed differently so that you can literally just steep them and you'll get color and you'll get sugars out of them without mashing. And so really all you need to do is just take them, put them in a bag, and, you heat your water up to, you put your water in the stock pot, and you heat it to, roughly 150, 160 degrees, and you just throw those grains in there for about 15 minutes. And that's just enough to soak out, the flavors and soak out the colors, and it allows you to kind of tweak the beer to exactly how you want it.
So steeping is more along the lines of if you're making tea, that's the tea bag, right?
Exactly. Okay.
Then, as far as the malts go, what are the different kinds of malts you can use, and what are you looking for? If you're tasting a beer, what are you looking for in different tastes, and what different malts cause those tastes?
Well, I mean, probably the three easiest sort of categories to break down malts into would be your base malts, your caramel malts, and then your roasted malts. And the difference is that your base malts tend to give you more bready type flavors. Like if you ever have like a Munich Helles or some of the lighter beers tend to be mostly the base malt, and those are bready. Sometimes you can even get a little bit of like a raisiny or figgy flavor from Munich malt, which is a darker base malt, but that's kind of sort of what you think is more your characteristic beer flavors. That's coming from your base malts. Then you have your caramel malts, which are kilned so that the sugars in the malt actually caramelize inside the malt, and those are going to give you sweeter flavors. And especially if you ever smell a beer and you get a sweet aroma, kind of like a brown sugar from it, that's usually from caramel malts. And then the third general category of malt would be your roasted malts, and that's what is obviously going to give you kind of roasty, coffee, kind of burnt flavors. That's where your stouts get their flavor and coloring from, and same with your porters. So I mean, there's a ton of specialty grains out there as well, but fundamentally, I would say those are kind of the three big categories.
So the next step, and here's where I started reading recipes, because I'm over here being all high and mighty and cocky with my Mr. Beer kit. Like, oh, hey, I can just buy things and like hops and malts and stuff, and I can throw that in there and I can make beer. And then I looked at a recipe guide, and I'm like, what the hell is a first flavoring? Here's where we actually add the hops.
Right.
So
right.
explain what the hops do, and then
Okay,
we'll work through the first, second, and third flavorings.
Right. Right. So hops basically have three contributions to beer. They're going to add bitterness, they're going to add flavor, and they're going to add aroma. And the thing with hops is that, I don't know if you do much cooking, or anybody else, anybody who's listening does cooking. The longer you boil something, you tend to lose the flavor out of it. And anytime, for example, anytime you want to use spices, things like, a lot of times they use them fresh and you add them at the end. And hops are kind of the same way. When you add the hops right away and you boil them for a long time, any of the oils that add flavor or aroma get boiled away, and all that's left is the alpha acids, which are what make beer bitter. So your first hop addition you do at the very beginning of the boil, all that's going to do is add the bitterness to the beer. Then your second addition you'll usually do, and you can do more, but for your typical 3 addition beer, your second addition is going to be your flavor addition, and that's around 15 minutes. And that's when you let it boil for 15 minutes, it's not boiling long enough that you're going to get a lot of bitterness out of it, but it's also boiling still. In that 15 minutes, the aroma is going to get boiled away, so what's left is just the flavor. And then your final hop addition, you'll usually add at the very end. And when you add it at the very end, it's not boiling enough to really give you much bitterness or flavor. But those aroma oils that are very volatile and that are going to boil off after 5 minutes, those are actually going to stay in your beer if you do it at the very end. And that's when you get the really fresh hop aroma.
So then the last aspect, so that's hops. And what are the different, like I've seen hop pellets, I've seen hop leaves. If you've seen the Sam Adams commercial, he's over there actually puts the hop leaves in his hand and putting them in there.
Yeah. Yep.
What are the different aspects of those? Do those matter?
In terms of pellet versus whole leaf, it's really not that big a deal unless like some people will do what's called dry hopping, which is where you actually add hops to your fermentation vessel after your primary fermentation is done. And then you want to use whole hops because if you put pellets in, they'll kind of gunk everything up. But when you're just making the beer, I wouldn't really, especially as a beginner, I wouldn't worry about whether you're using pellets or whole leaf hops. It's gonna come out just fine either way.
Now, the last aspect of it, so we have water. We really didn't discuss water yet. I'll get into that after this one, but it's water, the grain, hops, and then yeast. What are the different, what does yeast do to beer, and what are the different yeasts that you can find? And what do they do to the different beers?
Right. Yeast, is obviously that's what's going to break down your sugars into alcohol, and it's also going to produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct. So those are, 2 pretty important elements of beer. I don't think anybody wants to drink a flat non-alcoholic beer, but, the 2 fundamental types of yeast are lager yeast and ale yeast. And ale yeasts are fermented at a warmer temperature. Most homebrewers are going to use those because it happens to be the temperature that is like room temperature. And ale yeast, because they ferment at a higher temperature, tend to produce slight fruity flavors. It could be fairly subtle. Could be more like, for example, in a Hefeweizen or in some Belgian beers, it can actually be more pronounced. But lager yeast, on the other hand, should be very, very clean. You don't want to really produce much of any flavor out of those. So, depending on the style, nowadays you can get tons and tons of types of yeasts. And so, you can pick a yeast that's specific to the style you want to brew, because certain styles do get characteristic flavors from the yeast, and you can't really brew it unless you have that style.
Now, as far as the yeast go, the yeast that I deal with are from Mr. Beer. And they say, once you deal with the fermentation, like once you get the stuff in that keg, keep it between 68 and 76. And I have one of those little thermometers that you would put on your window to let you know what the temperature it is outside.
Right.
I have my keg covered in a towel with the thermometer on top of it, and I move that thing around my apartment because I cannot control the temperature in my apartment.
Right.
So I move it around my apartment as I see fit. Like, okay, he hasn't decided to turn on the heat today, so okay, we'll we'll put it near my TV because it's a little hotter over there. Or he's blasting it for some reason and it's 50 degrees, so we'll put it over here by the window. But for the different yeast, so the different yeasts have different temperature yields.
Yeah. And even like within ale yeast, different beers will have different yeasts will have different ranges, and even sometimes within the same yeast. For example, like a Hefeweizen. Hefeweizen is a German wheat beer that the characteristic flavors that the yeast produce are banana and clove. And if it typically most Hefeweizen yeast want to be between 60 and 68 degrees, but if you're closer to 68, you get more banana. If you're closer to 60, you get more clove. So sometimes even within a yeast style or a yeast strain, exactly what temperature you ferment at will give you a slightly different characteristic.
So now, before we get into the rest of it, the rest of the of the job that yeast does, explain what kind of water. Because I've been on several tours, and one of the I've been on. Let's see, one of the more enlightening ones was the Minhas tour that actually showed exactly the entire step of what everything does. But one aspect was water at the Sam Adams thing, where they're like, all right, we brewed our beer from Stony Brook, and the only beer the only water with the pH level from this was found in near Cincinnati. So that's where we brew the rest of our beer. How important is water to you?
Water is really not going to be a big deal when you're extract brewing, with one exception. And that, well, I should say a couple exceptions. I mean, first of all, if your water, tastes really minerally or really gross, that's going to carry over to your beer. The good thing is, if you're in Chicago, if you get city water, it's excellent brewing water. Some people like to fret about their water, tweak their water chemistry. I don't at all. Chicago water is great. The one caveat to that, though, is that you can run into issues with chlorine. Chlorine can actually cause off flavors. It can really kind of make hops more harsh. And so what I do, there are two things you can do. Well, actually three things. One thing is you can boil the water beforehand. Second thing you can do is let it sit overnight, and actually a lot of that chlorine will dissipate. Or the third thing you can do is use some sort of a water filter. I have a charcoal filter, and I just run my water through a charcoal filter. And really that's the only thing you need to worry about. But even there, I mean, I was brewing for probably a year and a half before I started messing with a filter, and I had a little bit of a tangy sort of note that I noticed from my beer, but it wasn't anything terrible.
One thing I noticed is, the apartment I'm living in now, it's above a restaurant, so you would think I have a pretty good water supply. But their pipes, I guess, just they're not pumping all the way to the top level.
Right.
It just doesn't, I've even noticed ice cubes don't taste well. So, I try not to even use my ice cubes. Yeah. So what I used for even Mr. Beer was Jewel spring water. Something consistent that I can buy that's probably going to be uniform every time.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are people that some places you can go and get those big jugs, kind of like the Hinckley and Schmidt type jugs, and get those filled. Some people use those. If you're doing a 2-gallon Mr. Beer kit, it's not a big deal. For me, when I'm brewing 5-gallon batches or 10-gallon batches and doing all grain where it takes a lot more water, it's kind of impractical for me to, I might end up using, 17, 18 gallons. So it's a little more impractical. But yeah, I mean, certainly, if you have access to, that kind of water, yeah, that definitely work great.
All right. So now we've dealt with water, malt, hops, and yeast. Now we're getting into the CO2, the thing that actually makes your beer kind of sizzle on your tongue when you actually taste it. So the yeasts are working to ferment the beer, and they're making CO2. So now we're getting into the actual bottling phase.
Mm-hmm.
What are the different ways to put CO2 in the beer?
Basically there are two. One is you can naturally carbonate it, which is where you let the yeast do the work. And then the other option is you can force carbonate it with a CO2 tank. Typically usually the only people who actually force carbonate are people who are kegging. which, most people aren't going to really start doing until they're kind of been doing it for a while and know that they want to sort of make the investment in being able to keg. But if, for typical homebrewer starting off, what all you're really going to do is when the beer is done fermenting and you're bottling, you add a little more sugar before you bottle. And what happens is once you cap the bottles, that there's still some yeast left in the beer, and that yeast is going to consume that extra sugar you just added. And as long as your bottle is sealed, that CO2 can't go anywhere else, so it stays in suspension in the beer, and there's your carbonation.
So my first attempt, and I talked about this on earlier Radio Exposed shows, I bottled my first attempt into 1 gallon bottles. And I feel I either didn't add enough sugar or I didn't let it sit long enough. So have you ever dealt with 1 gallon bottles, and would you go straight to don't even deal with those. Go to 12 ounce or go to 22 ounce. What would you recommend? I mean,
if you're going to drink the whole gallon, in a day or two, there's nothing wrong with that. My first thought would just be, depending on what kind of bottle it is, if it's like a screw top or something, you might run into issues where maybe you're not getting a tight seal. And obviously if you don't get a tight seal, you're not going to get full carbonation. A couple other things are that the temperature that you keep the beer at when it's conditioning is going to impact how long it takes to condition. If you happen to, leave it by your back door and there's a cold snap and, it's like 50 degrees back there, it's going to take longer than if if you have it at 68 degrees. But as long as you have a good seal and you add enough sugar, it shouldn't really matter if you're putting it in a 1 gallon jug or a 5 gallon keg or a 12 ounce bottle.
Now, when you're doing your conditioning, do you do it before you bottle, or once you ferment, you throw it into another tank? Is that when you're conditioning?
Yeah, I mean, I keg, and so, I basically, once it's done fermenting, I'll put it in the keg, and then I'll hook it up to CO2 tank set to where I want it at, and, after about a week, it's good to go. But, when I'm bottling, usually, when it's done fermenting, then you transfer it to another bucket. Then you add actually what I'll do is I'll put the sugar in first, then put the beer into the bucket. That way it helps to kind of make sure that the sugar is all mixed up. And then I'll bottle it, and then, it may be technically ready to go in a week, but a lot of times, or maybe 2 weeks, but a lot of times if you give it a couple more weeks, it really kind of hits its prime.
So I'm going to guess that that's where most of our listeners are, is that they are putting it in another thing ready for it to be bottled instead of kegged. What is the process to get it bottled?
Usually if you bought if you bought a kit or something where, you have a bottle with a spigot, that's the easiest way to do it, because then you just hook up a what's called a racking cane, which is basically a little stick where when you push down, it's spring loaded. And so, you open up the tap, but beer won't come out until you push the wand into the bottom of your bottle, and then it'll just fill up the bottle from the bottom, which is good because you don't want to mix in any oxygen. You don't want to splash. That could give you some cardboard flavors, later on. So, basically you just make sure your bottling sugar is mixed well in the bucket. And once it's mixed well, you sanitize all your bottles, fill them up with the bottling, or with the racking cane. And, when they're full, you just crimp them put bottle caps on and crimp them on, and you're good to go.
All right. So that is the process from start to finish of brewing beer. Now, we are in Chicago. Since you've already talked about brewing beer and you've talked about your passion with beer, we're in Chicago. What are your top 5 areas in Chicago where you're like, that's a beer I want? It could be a bar, it could be a store. What are your top 5 beers?
Well, the good thing about being in Chicago nowadays is that, pretty much anywhere in the city, you can find a good beer. And I mean, even down by me in Beverly, I complained for a long time that this was sort of a black hole of craft beer, but we've got, a brew pub that just opened up here called Horse Thief Hollow, and then a bar called Rock Island Public House that just opened up in just down the street in Blue Island. That's amazing. So, there are certain hot spots like, Logan Square right now has a lot of great stuff. Lincoln Square is always a great place to hit up. But, I think you can get a good beer anywhere. But I think in terms of the actual beers, I think there are five beers that I think give you like a pretty good overview of what's out there. And that are pretty easy to find here in Chicago. And the first one I would say is from Revolution Brewing, which is in Logan Square. And, they have a beer called Bottom Up Wit, which is a wit beer. And that's basically like it's a Belgian wheat. So it's very accessible for people who are kind of new to beer, but it's spiced with orange peel and coriander. It's kind of like Blue Moon is sort of a bastardized version of a wit beer, but Revolution makes a really good one called Bottom Up that you can get in cans. You can find pretty much anywhere now. Second one I would say is from Metropolitan Brewing. It's called Flywheel, and that's a lager. And the nice thing with Flywheel is that I think it shows you what a good light lager can be. It's light and accessible, but at the same time, it's got a lot of flavor, really good hop character to it. The third one is Lagunitas IPA, which Lagunitas is a brewery from Petaluma, California, but they're actually in the process of opening up a second brewery, right by Little Village here in Chicago. And their IPA is a great example of a nice hoppy beer, but also one that's balanced. So it's got malt flavor that kind of balances it out. The fourth one I would say is Two Brothers Cain and Abel. And Two Brothers is out in Warrenville, and Cain and Abel is a rye, a hoppy rye beer. And so it's nice because it's got a nice hoppiness to it, but it also has some spiciness from the rye. And then they use cane sugar in it as well. So that one I really like. And then the last one I'd throw out there is, from, Oscar Blues out in Colorado, and they have a beer called Old Chub that is a strong Scottish ale. And it's, very, very malty. A lot of people focus on the hops. Old Chub is all malt, but it's just a really, really awesome beer. So I think those are 5 beers. If you go out and find those 5, you'll have a really good idea of sort of the different styles that are out there and just the different flavors that beer can offer you.
All right. Our last thing is, I told you before we did the interview that we're going to do a recipe, as if we're all going to sit here as Radio Exposed listeners and sit here and do one. And too bad at the end there won't be like an oven that opens up like, hey, here's a finished beer. But it's something at least a uniform that we could do. It's not like, I'm doing this and I'm going to add this to it, I'm going to add this to it, and it's a surprise to everybody. This is an actual documented thing on the internet that everyone can find, and I'll post it on our pages, is a beer recipe. And this happens to be the White House Honey Ale. And I know this will probably burn the mouths of anyone who disagrees on anything on the White House, but I just found something that everyone can do. So our first step are the ingredients, and they do a malt extract version. So this is in your earlier stages of brewing beer.
Right. This is a very, very accessible recipe for anybody who wants to start.
So a 3.3 pound can of light malt extract. So that's easy to find.
Yep.
So then we got a 1 pound light dried malt extract. So
also very easy to find.
All right. 12 ounce crushed amber crystal malt.
Yeah, that's the crystal like I was telling you about before. That's going to just add a little bit of sweetness to it. And that's something that you can easily, walk into a homebrew store and just say, hey, I need 12 ounces of, crystal, and they'll hook you up.
All right. So and then we have 8 ounces of biscuit malt.
Yep, that's the more sort of aromatic malt. It's going to give you a little, as you might guess from the name, a little kind of biscuity flavor to it, just a little complexity.
Now here's where I think we might have to take some liberty. Is the 1 pound of White House honey. And
come on, you don't have a White House honey hookup?
I do not. As of yet, our president is from Chicago, but I don't think he's over there in Kentwood pimping out some honey. So I think I'm going to just buy regular honey at this point.
I think that'll work.
All right, then we're getting into some of the hops now. So we have 1.5 ounces of the Kent Goldings hop pellets.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have 1.5 ounces of the Fugels hop pellets, which almost sounds like a Boston area stop.
It's actually it's pronounced Fuggles if you want to impress the guys at the homebrew store. But both Kent Golding and Fuggles are both traditional British hops. They tend to be fairly kind of earthy and herbal as opposed to like American hops, which tend to be more citrusy and piney.
So then we have two teaspoons of gypsum.
That's your water treatment that we were talking about before. I honestly wouldn't even bother with it here.
Yeah, gypsum was I just went to the Brew and Grow in Roselle, and I saw gypsum. Like, I forgot. Yeah, I saw that word in something that I saw. It's like, oh yeah, that's something. All right, so gypsum conditional. You might not have to put it in there.
I mean, I'm sure there are guys who are way more hardcore about their water chemistry who are going to get mad at me for saying that, but just my 2 cents.
Now, a package of Windsor dry ale yeast. One package, is that a standard unit?
For that, yeah, basically. Pretty much everybody, whether you get dry yeast or liquid yeast, they all say that, the one package is good enough for a 5-gallon batch of beer.
Okay. Because I don't want to find out that you were supposed to put 3 tablespoons of that in, not one package. Like when you find out one package is like a 5-pound bag.
Right. Worst comes to worst, just usually there should be something on the label that will say, this is enough for 5 gallons or whatever.
All right. So in our directions, we had already gone over what to do. So in a 12-quart pod now, we steep the grains. That's where you dip the bag into it as if it were like a tea bag, right? Yeah.
And the one thing that I would add just to keep in mind, it's really the only way you can screw up steeping your grains is you don't want to let it get above roughly 165 or so, because once you get higher than that, you start to leach what are called tannins. And if anybody's familiar with wine, a lot of wine people talk about tannins, but it's sort of like leaves a very kind of dry kind of flavor in your mouth, and it's not pleasant. So just whatever you do, don't stick the grains in there. Leave your temperature on, and then all of a sudden, next thing you know, it's boiling.
As far as that temperature goes, what type of thermometer would you suggest in a giant pot like that? Like, is there a big thermometer that hangs out the side, or is there something?
You can. I mean, if you go to a homebrew store, you can buy. They have floating thermometers. They have ones that have a little kind of hook on them. What I tend to use is you can also just buy one of those like kind of probe thermometers that has the little cord on it, and you just stick hook the little probe on over the edge, and you got your little display that tells you what temperature's in there.
Would you prefer to do this over a stove or like a propane heater or something like that?
I think for something like this, especially when you're starting out, I think most people do it with stove. It's really not until you start kind of getting a little more hardcore that you might want to go outside and, buy your turkey fryer or some sort of burner like that.
All right, so the second step is to add the 2 cans of the malt extract and bring that to a boil. That should be a pretty easy step for even my listeners. I hope so. The next step, for the first flavoring, that's when you add the first bit of hops, and they also say to add the gypsum.
Yeah.
And you piss in the face of all those people who say they add the gypsum.
I do, because I'm a rebel like that.
So you start once it starts boiling, that's when you add the first flavoring. And then you let it go for 15 minutes, you said?
This is going to be for 40, they're doing let me just double check here. They're doing a 45-minute boil for this.
45 minutes.
So this first edition is going to boil for all 45 minutes of your boil.
So all 45 minutes. So you can go to your DVR and watch an hour-long something without the commercials, and then you go back to your beer.
Exactly.
So now we're to the second flavoring. That's when you add the Fuggles hops pellets. All right, so you add those, and then you let that boil for a little more. Now, they say this is where you add the honey, and you boil for another 5 minutes. When you do other flavorings, like something that adds more fruit to your beer, or the Bud Light adds lime to it, is this around the point where you do something like that? Or
always be careful when you add the lime to your Bud Light.
I would not add it at all. I would no. I don't even add lime to my Corona. However, I just don't drink Corona.
That's probably a good idea.
No, full disclosure, the last beer I just made is a knockoff version of Corona, so I don't even know what to add to that. I think I'm just going to add like an entire lime and just shove the juice into my face before I drink it.
Whatever works for you. I'm a big believer in if it tastes good to you, drink it. Don't worry what anybody else thinks.
So in the stage of flavorings, where would you experiment? Where let's say you're making a recipe and you're like, you know what, screw this. I'm going to make a blank. And you just decide to divert. Where would like a home brewer decide to divert and make their own recipe?
Well, I mean, I think it's, I think ultimately that should sort of be your, any home brewer's goal is to, some people, I guess, just like to try to recreate beers, and that's fine. But to me, initially kind of you stick to the script and get an idea of what ingredients do what. But I think your ultimate goal should be to experiment with different stuff, because that's what's fun. I mean, I've brewed several beers with Cocoa Puffs because it's just something that I did once and I thought it was kind of funny and it came out well. So, I've done it a few more times. But typically, when it comes to sort of messing with different flavors and stuff, whether it's honey, whether it's, you can do things like coffee. I'm actually drinking a coffee stout right now that I brewed. A lot of that stuff, what I'll do is, and this is actually the one area where I take issue with this recipe, aside from the gypsum, is I wouldn't add the honey to the boil. I would actually add it after the primary fermentation. And the reason for that is that when you start fermenting, you get this, your beer's gonna bubble up and it's gonna, have this big kind of frothy head looking thing on it. And that's all from the CO2 that's caused during fermentation. That's all kind of flying through the beer, and it actually strips out a lot of your flavor and aroma with it. And so I think that if you want to get more flavor out of stuff you add, I wait till primary fermentation is done and then add it. That's how I added coffee to this. When I do fruit beers, that's when I add fruit. And when I do honey beers, that's when I add the honey. So that's how I would do it. But, again, part of the fun of homebrewing is experimenting. So, try it this way, try it the other way, see which one you like more.
That's the one step I did want to ask you about is I saw the pictures on your blog of the mess made from from the fermentation and the runoff. Mr. Beer does not have that. When you do Mr. Beer, it's you do the step. Let's see, in this recipe, it's the step 6. So you add the boiled thing to the keg, which is already in 4 quarts of water, of cold water.
Mm-hmm.
So you add the hot to that thing, and that already brings it to a temperature where you add the yeast. And then you top it off with whatever brings it to 8.5 gallons or 8.5 quarts. And then you cap it, and then there's slits in the top that allow the CO2 to escape. But I don't get the mess. What do you do when you're doing that step? What is it in, and what creates the mess?
Well, it really, it's during the primary fermentation, same thing that you did. But really there are a few different things that will determine whether or not you get a mess. One is how much headspace you have. The more space you have, the safer off you are in terms of having, things bubble over.
And in my keg, it's about halfway.
What's that?
In my keg, it's about halfway, so I have enough space to deal with it. You
probably have the, roughly the same amount of, it's called Kreuzen is the technical term for all that stuff. But, you probably had roughly the same amount that I did. It's just that, you had way more airspace. In my situation, I was using plastic carboys and I got a little bigger yield than I thought I did, and they were basically filled almost to the top to begin with. So, that's going to be a big part of it. And then also how strong your beer is going to, impact how strong your fermentation is. And then the last thing is the kind of yeast you use and the heat, the temperature that you ferment at. Those are all going to determine whether you get a crazy volcano or whether it looks completely under control.
So then our last step is step 9. Rack into a secondary fermenter for 5 days. So you've already done the fermenting for 7 days. And then what is racking?
Racking is just the term for going from one vessel to another. I have no idea where the term came from. But yeah, the idea here is that sometimes if you, you're going to have some gunk in the beer from, whether it's leftover bits of hops, whether it's, protein that coagulates and falls out of the beer, whether it's, and dead yeast, as the yeast gets done fermenting. And so the idea here is sometimes people like to get the beer off of that gunk at the bottom of the keg or the bucket, because if you let it sit there for too long, it can start to actually impart off flavors on the beer. But some people don't. Most of the time, I don't do secondary fermentation. I usually just let it sit for about a week and a half and just go straight to a keg. So it all depends on what works for you.
So something like that probably will work for me, because a 2-gallon keg like I have probably yields about 22 bottles of beer. I got 24 out of it, but the last 2 bottles are really cloudy, and my girlfriend was helping me. I'm like, yeah, just dump those. Those don't look good at all. And there's probably a lot of sediment that was at the bottom of this, a lot of the yeast clumps.
Right.
So that's what that was. So like racking would be something that I would probably benefit from my aspect, but I don't have another keg to deal with.
Right. But yeah, I mean, that would be the benefit of doing that. Yes.
All right. Well, I think our listeners are ready to start brewing their own beer, and I want them to be named after me, please. Well, Beverly Brewmaster, thank you for joining us. You've enlightened all of our listeners, and I'm pretty sure within 3 or 4 weeks, roughly, all of our listeners will be churning out radio exposed beer, and I'll be dominating the world.
I hope so. That just when you're overlord, don't forget that I helped you out for a little bit. So
I'll give you 5%.
All right, sounds good.
All right, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.